All right, moving on with historic globalization in the United States of America. It's hard to talk about historic globalization in the USA without talking about the transatlantic slave trade. So, we just watched 3 quick videos on the transatlantic slave trade, and before we get to unpacking this source, I want to see what your takeaways from those videos were. So looking down at your notes, what kinds of notes do you have? How could we describe the transatlantic slave trade? What's one thing you have down? Transatlantic slave trade, yes?
Took place between 1400s and 1800s.
So 1400s and 1800s, right? So it took place between the 15th and 19th century, 1400s to the 1800s. That's one way to describe it. 12.5 million African slaves, mostly men, so it'll change the demographics of Africa. Yes?
20% of them died on the way there.
So 20% of the Africans will die along the trip. So now we're getting some numbers to establish the size of the transatlantic slave trade. Yep.
Some of the Africans came sold Africans for European goods.
Yeah, so, what was the trade itself, right? So if it's the transatlantic slave trade, what was being traded? And there were these 3 points of interest. In the Americas, we had cotton and other crops like tobacco being raised, but these are labor-intensive crops. So they needed labor, and some indigenous workers were available, but many resisted, or others had died from the introduction of disease. So the new colonies in the Americas needed workers to continue their production of cotton and rum and tobacco. So the cotton, rum, and tobacco would be sent from the Americas to Europe, where they'd be put into, more finished goods like clothing or rum to drink. And then the rum and weapons and clothes would be sent to Africa to be traded. So the African kings would buy the weapons, buy the rum, use the weapons to go to war with their neighbors, and in effect become more powerful, but also get more slaves that they could trade with the next boat coming to get more weapons. And it created a cycle of violence where the war fueled the trade and the trade fueled the war. Absolutely. And it continues to destabilize Africa today. Yes?
The men and women were separated on the ship, the
So-
men being kept in the belly of the ship.
Yeah, so the men are mostly kept down below, and the conditions, words to describe it, we have things like inhuman. We know that a number of them would die. Eventually they'd be tossed off the ship, but you'd be laying with them, you're shackled together. When they were brought aboard the ship or up top, they were meant to dance for the entertainment of the crew, and the women and children, they were abused by the crew. And we definitely can probably figure out what that means. Yes?
1/10 of ships often destroyed them.
So yes, things are so bad that 1/10 of the ships would often, there would be a rebellion on board.
Once the slavery was banned in the Americans, I think it was, in 1807, the African economy collapsed.
Yeah, so in Europe, the British and French will be the first to outlaw slavery. The Americans will wait another 50 years. So it'll be the 1850s in the U.S. Outlaws slavery, but the British and French do, and it destabilizes the economies in Africa because the economies were slave-based, meaning that the main commodity they had to sell were slaves, and when they didn't have them to sell, then they were easy to then colonize. So the slave trade also leads to the 19th century scramble for Africa, and then the colonization because they had little ability to resist.
The conditions on the ship were unimaginably brutal.
Unimaginably brutal. So that's great language. So a number you're writing is already above grade level. So that's fantastic. Grade level is like a 60. So a number of you are already writing above that, but I want to keep pushing you. And one way to push you is to start picking up little phrases like that. Yeah.
The journey could take like 2 to 3 months.
2 to 3 month journey, people dying around you, 120 degrees Fahrenheit weather. You can't sit up because the roof is so low. You're shackled to the people around you. You don't know where you're going. You think the people that are taking you there are cannibals because you've heard this story that the white-skinned people are cannibals. It's an unimaginative, now I can't say it. It's horrible. It's inhumane. Anything else about the transatlantic slave trade? Yes.
They were saved to prevent rice and branded.
Yeah, so you're forced to march to the sea. So some people won't even make it to the sea. And then when they get to the sea, they'll be shaved. Now, I'm standing here with a bald head, and obviously, like, shaving my head's not a big thing, but for many of them, it's a cultural thing. You're taking away their culture when you're shaving them, and then they're branded. And branding can be quite painful. So they're branded because now they're not people, they're property. That's the branding. What else might be done to mark them as property? That some of the ship's captains,
Their ears are cut off.
they cut off their ears to show that they've been sold, that they're owned by someone. So horrific conditions. And again, remember we talked about how this is globalization, right? So take me a step back and explain how the transatlantic slave trade is a product of globalization. Yes?
Things were starting to get traded through countries, and then when countries didn't have things to trade back for the goods they wanted, they just started selling slaves because they didn't have the goods other countries.
Yeah, so it's definitely the economic part, the economic driver of globalization, the economic dimension. We're seeing trade. And it was trade that wasn't possible before the 15th century. So what made it possible? The Chinese had this invention, gunpowder. The Europeans take the invention and create weapons out of it. Then they use the weapons to go and control the Africans and sell weapons to the Africans to control and fight each other. So we have this externality, this idea that somebody in China creates fireworks. They didn't know that it was going to lead to Europeans creating weapons that they used to enslave the Africans so that they could create labor for these labor-intensive industries in the Americas. So the Americas hadn't even been discovered by the Chinese or Europeans when fireworks were created. But this is globalization as a wave of change. Globalization creates a wave of change as you often have unintended and unexpected results, externalities of our actions. So now we have a photograph. So another source that you could get in a A1. We've looked at cartoons, we've looked at charts, we've looked at quotes. We'll do a little bit more charts, but we've looked at those three. You could also get a photograph. It's pretty common you get a photograph as one of the three on the diploma exam. So looking at this photograph, we need to connect it to globalization. So the connection to globalization here is we have an individual who was affected directly by the transatlantic slave trade. This is a man who was a slave. So the connection between the photograph and globalization is this photograph is a man who was a part of the transatlantic slave trade, so you could talk about the slave trade. His name was Whip Peter. His actual name was Gordon. His actual African name is not known. He was an enslaved African American who escaped from a Louisiana plantation in March 1863, gaining freedom when he reached the Union camp near Baton Rouge, and he became known as the subject of photographs documenting the extensive scarring of his back from whippings received in slavery. So, I've said before that when we have sources, we have many steps we can do. First thing, connected to globalization. So this connects to this transatlantic slave trade. Second thing, there should be some kind of value statement about globalization here. Here they're presenting a problem with globalization, because globalization has led to the exploitation, the cruel treatment of Africans. So they're saying this is a flaw of globalization. The photographer is saying, hey, look, this transatlantic slave trade is showing that by nature, when we look in the mirror of globalization, we see bad things. And if globalization is flawed, mankind's flawed. So if we want to improve the nature of mankind, we have to improve the nature of globalization. The solution that they want, we need to outlaw slavery. We need to protect African Americans. We need to have legislation in place. We need laws to be created to protect people from being whipped. That's the solution that we can infer. The solution is they want an end to whipping. That's why they're showing that. The focus of the photo is on the whipping. They want us to emotionally get attached to the photo and say that's wrong. That's the emotional response they want us to elicit, right? The emotional response they want to elicit is they want us to look at it and say that's a wrong practice. So the change they're trying to create is the outlawing of whipping, and by extension, the outlawing of slavery. So why do they want to outlaw slavery? Because they look at globalization, interconnectedness of man, and they say when we connect, bad things happen. So we need to change our nature. We need to move away from being exploitive to being kind, and we need to have legislation to control those people that would still be exploitive if they're allowed to be that. So, and I'll get to your question in a second. When we analyze a photograph, we have to look at it from the situation of, under what circumstances would somebody say, what do I think about globalization? Well, here's a photograph. Look at the photograph and you can see whether globalization is good or bad. Another perspective would be, what does this guy in the photograph think about it? And I think after watching those videos, we could assume that African Americans weren't thrilled about globalization and about the slave trade. Yes?
I'm not sure, but there's something better. So now, wasn't there a group of people that if you were enslaved by them for a certain amount of time, you get freedom? Like if you were enslaved for like 5 years, there would be freedom?
5 seems pretty short.
No, I think it was like 5 and some like people would do that. Or it was like 25.
It does seem like a practice, like are there some people that you could serve a time period and then no longer be a slave? In the South, many of these slaves were generational, meaning that their children would be born a slave and they'd become slave. So would there be some families or some locations where, after 5 years of work you'd be free? Probably.
It was like 25 years or something.
Yeah.
Like basically.
But I don't think I could take 3 months of being treated like that. Yeah. So tomorrow, we're going to continue our look at the slave trade by looking at some other sources. Tomorrow I'll give you some more chance to read through the textbook and see what else is happening in the Americas at this time. The Americas is mentioned in chapter 5 and 7, so it jumps around a little bit. And we're still progressing our way through this unit on historic globalization. But the next source you might see might be this source, because I need you to do a photograph. So in a photograph, I want you to be able to talk about the perspective of the person presenting the photo. So whether that's the photographer or simply the person presenting the photo as an ideological perspective and saying, this is what I think of globalization. But we also have the perspective of that person within the photo. Now, we don't know Gordon or Whip Peter personally, but we can infer what he would have thought about slavery. You still have 5 minutes. I'm going to come by with the wipes and you can clean up your area and kind of take a breath and say, oh my, we covered a lot today, and see if you understand the transformative nature of cultural contact and the institution of slavery.